Hi, my name is Bart van Wassenhove. I'm a lecturer here in the University Scholars Programme. I'm a historian of philosophy by training, and I teach a module here on conditions of happiness.
Hi, I'm Dr. Charles. I'm a quantitative reasoning lecturer here in the University Scholars Program. I'm trained as a geographer, and I'm interested in quantitative social science.
So we will consider a few questions about happiness, right? So the first one, right? So the first question is happiness a choice, right? So I would say it's partly a choice. I think it would be an exaggeration to say that happiness is entirely a choice, right? I mean, some self-help gurus have said that happiness is entirely up to you, but I do think that it is easier to become happy, I think, if you have the right kind of upbringing, the right kind of social circumstances, material well-being, security, right? So there's a lot of factors, I think, that provide a foundation for happiness. Beyond that, I think happiness can be a choice, right? If you're already in reasonably good circumstances, I do think there are things you can do to make yourself happier, right? But ultimately, I think it's a combination of external factors and your own choice.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with Bart here, is that even things like your genetics play a role in your happiness. I kind of think of this as sort of oil-rich nations, and so some people are sort of born oil-rich, others aren't, and so they need to do more to develop their resources. And so there are social psychologists that can help you develop those resources, but then even outside of that, there are those external factors like just your culture, the country, policies, all of those things affect your happiness. Question
Consensus.
two, yeah.
Question two, yeah, so do you wanna?
All right, let me peel it off here. How can happiness be measured? Okay, so I guess I'm the measurement specialist here, being the quantitative reasoning lecturer. And so happiness, from a social science standpoint, is measured in self-report. So you'll ask a question about, how satisfied are you with your life on a scale from, say, 0 to 10. And if we take all of those self-reports and we sort of aggregate them up into large numbers, they tend to be pretty reliable. And so there's a difference between validity and reliability. If I wanted to know with validity how to measure your happiness, I'd have to sit down with you and I have to collect a bunch of qualitative data and information, just like a psychologist. But for reliability, if I wanted to say, is Singapore happier than, say, Qatar? Well, then I could use all of those self-reports at the, aggregate up to the country level and say, with reasonable reliability, yes or no.
Right. Yeah, so I would agree that we can measure happiness with reasonable reliability, right? If you want to get more targeted and say, like, this is an absolutely objective measure of happiness, right? Where we can tell exactly, here is your number for happiness, right? Then that really ups the stakes, right? Because as a philosopher, I'm always interested in the question, what happiness actually is, right? And so we might all think that we know what happiness is, but in fact people are still debating exactly what happiness is, whether happiness is different in different cultures or is the same universally, right? To what extent happiness or views about happiness might depend based on your demographic and some of your individual inclinations, right? So if you look at it on the smaller level of sort of having absolute certainty that you can measure the happiness of individuals, right? There it becomes quite tricky, I would say, and there, and I think even in the larger case of assessing validity, I think it's important to bring people from the different disciplines together, right? And so I think to make these surveys both precise and targeted and valid, I think it's important to bring together social scientists, philosophers, right? People from different backgrounds who can all complement each other.
Yeah, right? We can work together. Yeah. And that sort of interdisciplinary spirit is the USP spirit as well. So
exactly. So, how can happiness lead to success, right? I do think happiness can lead to success, right? And I think there's some pretty good evidence that people who come across as happy are going to be more successful in life, right? They might have an easier time making friends, getting a job, getting promoted in their jobs, right? So in that sense, I mean, and this is mostly about projecting happiness, right? Because if you look happy, people are going to think you're likable, easy to get along with, maybe effective at your job, right? So to some extent, you could even fake this, right? I mean, you could fake happiness and reap the benefits of sort of the perception of happiness, right? I think, I mean, That can be a problem in some cases, right? Because some people just project their happiness more openly than others, right? People who are more extroverted are more likely to come across as happy and reap those benefits, right? But I would say that, I mean, once you get away from just perception of happiness, right? People who are actually happy doing what they do, I think are much more likely to actually be better at what they do, right? I mean, if you love your job, right, and you really care about your job and you want to do it right, I think you're much more likely to succeed, right, and to be really good at what you do, right? Of course, here it comes back down to the first one, right? So is happiness a choice, right? I mean, we choose our jobs to a certain extent, but we don't always get the job that gives us all the perspectives and all the options, right? So there is still a factor of luck involved, I think. Just being happy doesn't make you successful per se, but it can certainly help.
Yeah. I mean, as a scientist, you're always sort of wondering, is it correlation or is it causation? And so this is kind of a causation type question, where it's like, does one thing cause the other? But you could look at it in reverse. I mean, are successful people more happy?
Right.
And so, you know, the real challenge is kind of untangling all of those things, you know, which comes first and which has the greatest effect in whichever direction.
Good.
All right, next
We're agreeing
question.
on everything here.
Yeah, which is good. But maybe not for the audience. Maybe we should disagree on this last one.
Okay.
Can happiness be a bad thing? Can happiness be a bad thing? This one you might disagree with me on. I mean, I really don't know. In the body of evidence, there's some things that are different. So if you're trying to measure different concepts, you need to measure the concept, the whole concept, nothing but the concept. And so, you know, there's this relationship between meaning and meaningfulness and happiness. And so they're not perfectly correlated with one another. You can imagine somebody living a really meaningful life, say, you know, a political activist, and they're not super happy. And then you could imagine somebody living a super happy life. I mean, they're a trust fund kid or something like that, but not really meaningful. And so I think that, you know, those two are related to one another. And I think to live a real fulfilling life, you probably need them both in some sort of balance. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I would say, I mean, happiness we automatically assume to be a good thing, but I think it depends on the circumstances, right? So let's imagine that someone is at the funeral of a loved one and they just seem like they're beaming with happiness. I think everyone would feel like there's something wrong with that, right? That there's certain circumstances where it's not just socially inappropriate to be happy, but I mean, people might wonder sort of, is there something wrong with you if you're happy in circumstances that aren't conducive to it, right? So I do think, I mean, Aristotle was right in some way, right? When he said that with things like happiness and pain and pleasure, it's all about experiencing them sort of at the right time, to the right degree, right, in the right circumstances, right, kind of just being attuned to your circumstances, right?
Yeah. I'm seeing more overlaps between science and philosophy here,
exactly.
just by talking,
Yeah, maybe, I mean, I would just also want to tweak the question, right, because we can talk about the state of happiness, right, whether that can be a good or a bad thing, but we can also talk about the pursuit of happiness, right? And I think one thing that has come out of recent research is that people who pursue happiness very aggressively, right, people who are very focused on feeling good all the time, actually tend to be less happy, right? So depending on how you pursue happiness, whether you pursue it in this very calculating and goal-oriented way, or you pursue it more indirectly, right? I mean, that can have an impact as well on the quality of your happiness.
All these questions are tied together. It goes back to, is happiness a choice?
Right.
Those type of things. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to start making some connections sort of up and down the board here. Ready for the last one?
Sure, yeah.
All right. I want to know about USP Modules. Okay, well, this is kind of related to happiness in some way. I hope all the students in my classes are happy. I know I'm happy to teach them. You know, let me tell you a little bit about my module. So quantitative reasoning, what does that mean? And I've kind of defined it as thinking about data and thinking with data. So thinking with data would be, we're digging into some spreadsheets and we're looking at correlations, we're creating some data visualizations. Thinking with data is, or thinking about data is just sort of the overarching, you know, when do we apply sort of data-driven reasoning, data-driven argumentation. What's the strengths of that? What's the weakness of that? So that part is really hard because it's hard for me to teach you how to think. And so, in my classes, students need to come to me with things that they're interested in. You have to come to me, you have to bring your curiosity to me. I'm interested in the relationship between, say, happiness and internet usage or something like that. And then we can start exploring those things. So that's how I teach my class.
Right. Okay, so could probably talk for a few hours about USP modules in general, but I'll just tell you a little bit about my module that I already mentioned, Conditions of Happiness, right? So this is a first year writing and critical thinking module, right? So one of the main goals of this module is to teach you how to become a better writer and how to become a better thinker, right? And just the topic that we use to teach you these skills, in this case, is happiness, right? And so I approach happiness from a philosophical perspective, right? So the main question that we start the semester is what is happiness, right? I mean, it seems a very straightforward question. Most people will have some kind of an answer to that question, but it's actually something that's been debated for at least the past 2,500 years, right? So we read different perspectives from different philosophical schools. We look at sort of the advantages and disadvantages of different definitions of happiness. And then in the second half of the semester, we consider some broader questions about, for example, what Charles already mentioned, the relationship between happiness and meaning, right? To what extent do those overlap? And to what extent should we pursue either or both, right? Are they both part of a larger category like a good life, right? We also look at things like the relation between happiness and morality, right? Do you need to be a good person to be happy, right? Or can you be a bad person and still be happy, right? Does being a bad person preclude being happy in some way, right? So these are all big philosophical questions, right? And so we don't set out, or at least I don't set out in this module with the goal that we're going to answer those questions in 13 weeks, right? I mean, if people have been talking about these questions for more than 2,000 years, we are not going to answer them in 13 weeks. But I think there's real value in trying, right? And sort of setting yourself these really challenging questions and seeing how far you get. And I think many students are surprised how far we do in fact get, how deeply we get into these questions and really think about a very everyday concept like happiness in a sort of much deeper way.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what makes USP unique as well, is that we do focus on, say, the questions, rather than coming up with the answers. We understand that, some of these questions we just simply can't answer in 13 weeks. And maybe there is no, right answer. But looking at it from different perspectives, asking different questions is really important to our greater overarching sort of understanding of something like happiness. So thanks for joining us here today, USP Open Day. I hope to see you in one of our classes sometime soon. If you feel that looking at something like happiness from two different perspectives, a social science perspective and a philosophical perspective, is something for you, well, come down and see us sometime. Thanks. Bye.